They say the 60s died on the night of August 9, 1969, but no one ever asks why it died so brutally. Leo Barnes lived among the ghosts of that story. Now in his 50s, he was a veteran journalist whose cynicism had worn his passion down to a nub. His office at the LA Chronicle was a living relic. Yellowed stacks of old papers, the scent of cold coffee, and a map of Los Angeles studded with faded pins. As a hungry young reporter, he had pushed his way through the courthouse crowds, chronicling every deranged testimony, every crazed smile of the Manson family. He had helped introduce the world to the monster, but deep down he always knew he'd missed the real story. In the summer of 1994, an old ghost came knocking. An editor from a major New York magazine called, his voice bright with ambition. "Leo, we want you for a special feature. The 25th anniversary of the Tate LaBianca murders." A look back. "You were there," Leo reluctantly agreed. To him it was an old scar that was best left alone. He spent an afternoon in the newspaper's dusty archive, sifting through old film negatives. He skimmed past the images that were seared into the national consciousness. The front door with the word pig scrawled in blood, the fanatical face of Susan Atkins, the hollow eyes of Charles Manson. But then he paused. A photo he'd never paid much attention to. It wasn't taken at the trial or a crime scene. It was from Spahn Ranch, maybe a year before it all went to hell. It showed Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Susan Atkins sitting on a wooden fence laughing in the California sun. They weren't monsters. They were just girls in floral dresses, their eyes a mixture of hope and emptiness. They were children of the summer of love. Leo set the photograph down. A paradox. The question he had subconsciously avoided for 25 years suddenly crystallized. He had written about the monsters. He had never stopped to ask about the children. The story wasn't what had happened. The story was how it could have possibly happened. How could the flowers of a generation pick up knives and turn a dream into America's worst nightmare? The editor wanted a story about a devil. But Leo Barnes knew the real story wasn't about who pulled the trigger. It was about what had loaded the gun. A university library became Leo's first battleground. He spent hours in a cold basement room, hunched over an old microfilm reader. Each turn of the mechanical crank scrolled him backward into another world. On the faded screen, newspaper headlines from 1967 and 1968 appeared like ghosts. Typefaces filled with an optimism his generation had long since lost. Leo wasn't looking for the murders. He was looking for the pulse of the era that had given birth to them. The archival newsreels he watched were silent, but they screamed. Crowd sitting cross-legged in the grass of Golden Gate Park, a sea of long hair and flower crowns. Slender fingers placing a daisy into the barrel of a baby-faced National Guardsman's rifle. In Haight-Ashbury, communes held their doors wide open, welcoming anyone with a guitar and an open heart. It was a revolution not of bullets but of refusal. Refusal of war, of materialism, of the rigid rules of their parents' generation. Leo, a man who had lived through 3 wars and 2 recessions, watched these images with a mixture of nostalgia and dread. He remembered that feeling in the air. It was a belief naive to the point of being radical, that people were fundamentally good, that if you gave love, you would only receive love in return. Vans full of nameless kids crisscrossed the country, sleeping on strangers' floors, sharing their last scraps of food. They called each other brother and sister upon first meeting. They trusted. It was their religion. And then, amid the images of peace and love, Leo began to see the cracks. He read editorials from the time, concerned articles about runaways flooding into San Francisco and Los Angeles with no money, no plan, utterly vulnerable. He saw photos of young faces with eyes already hollowed out by drugs. The promise of a free paradise was also an open invitation to predators. Against this backdrop, the emergence of Charles Manson and his family felt less like a grotesque mutation and more like an inevitable product of the environment. He didn't need to break down the door. He just had to knock and smile. He arrived with the simple message an entire generation was desperate to hear. I love you. You belong here. He didn't offer a complex ideology. He offered a sanctuary. He was a shepherd who had appeared at the exact moment there were too many lost sheep. Leo stopped the projector. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the still image of a smiling group of hippies on the screen. He pulled out his battered reporter's notebook. He could feel it, The first rule, the foundation for everything that came after. It wasn't a written law, but a cultural contract. He wrote it down, the letters scrawled but certain. Rule number 1. The door is never closed. It wasn't just the physical doors of houses and communes. It was the doors of the mind. It was the willingness to accept the most radical ideas without skepticism, to embrace charismatic leaders without scrutiny. In their quest to tear down all the walls of the old society, they had inadvertently torn down their own most basic human defenses, their vigilance. Leo understood that Charles Manson wasn't an invader. He was a virus that had found a host with a fatally compromised immune system. He weaponized their own faith against them. He turned their openness into isolation, their love into control. He walked into an unlocked house, and once inside, he changed all the locks. He turned off the projector, and the room plunged into total darkness. He had the first piece of the puzzle. The foundation of the nightmare wasn't built with brick and mortar. It was built with naive faith. And in a world of absolute trust, a shepherd who was secretly a wolf could walk freely among the flock, unquestioned, until it was far too late. Having identified the stage, Leo Barnes turned his attention to the players. He left the library and returned to his fortress of solitude, the newspaper office, where he'd had archival boxes delivered, filled with court records, deposition transcripts, and cold, clinical psych evaluations. If the 60s was the storm, this was the wreckage it left behind. He didn't start with Charles Manson. That was the mistake every other journalist made. They always started with the devil, forgetting that a devil cannot act alone. Instead, Leo laid out the old press photos of the key female members on his cluttered desk. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten. The faces from the Spahn Ranch photograph. He wanted to know who they were before they were given new names, before Susan became Sadie Mae, before Patricia became Katie. He began with Susan Atkins. Her file was thick, a tragedy of middle-class ennui. She was born to a decent family in San Jose, hard-working parents, a nice home. But as Leo read deeper, the cracks appeared. Susan's mother died a painful death from cancer while she was a teenager. Her father, broken by grief and debt, grew distant, turning to alcohol. Susan, once a shy girl in the church choir, was suddenly an orphan in her own home. She dropped out of school, drifted to San Francisco, became a topless dancer, desperate for attention, desperate for someone to tell her she was special. Leo underlined a sentence in a psychological review. Subject exhibits a profound need for approval from an authoritarian, specifically paternal figure. Next came Patricia Krenwinkel. A different story, but the same ache. Patricia had always felt like an outsider. She was overweight, insecure, a frequent target of schoolyard taunts. Her family, like Susan's, was outwardly normal but inwardly cold and disconnected. She felt invisible. Leo read her testimony, where she described meeting Charles Manson for the first time. For the first time in my life, a man told me I was beautiful. That single sentence to Patricia was more potent than any drug. It was what she had been searching for her entire life. And then Leslie Van Houten, perhaps the most tragic case. Intelligent, popular, a high school homecoming princess, a picture-perfect life. Until her parents' bitter divorce shattered her world. Leslie's foundation crumbled. She began experimenting with LSD, diving into the counterculture, looking for something more real than the suburban facade she'd known. She wasn't running from poverty or abuse. She was running from emptiness. Leo leaned back in his chair, the 3 life stories laid out before him like different roads leading to the same cliff. He saw an undeniable pattern. These were not born criminals. These were children carrying deep psychological wounds. Each of them had a different kind of hunger. A hunger for attention, a hunger for acceptance, a hunger for meaning. They were ships without rudders, adrift on the chaotic ocean of the 1960s. And Charles Manson, a master manipulator, saw that hunger. He didn't invite them to join a cult. He invited them into a family. Leo realized that the Manson family wasn't just a name. It was the product Manson was selling. He wasn't just a leader. He cast himself as the father they all craved or had lost. He gave them new names, new rules, a structure in a world that seemed to have none. He gave Susan the attention she craved, Patricia the validation she needed, and Leslie a cause to believe in. In return, they gave him their absolute loyalty. He pulled out his notebook. The second rule emerged, clear as a scar. It explained why they had walked through the unlocked door of rule number 1, and more importantly, why they had stayed. He wrote, Rule number 2, the found family. The counterculture had encouraged its youth to abandon their biological families. What it failed to anticipate was that the fundamental human need for a family, for a tribe, for a place to belong, would never disappear. It simply created a vacuum. Charles Manson stepped into that vacuum. He ruthlessly exploited the emotional starvation of an entire generation. He didn't offer freedom. He offered a new kind of slavery, a bondage even stronger than the rules they'd run from because it came disguised under the most beautiful name of all, family. Leo looked back at the 3 photos. He no longer saw 3 young women. He saw 3 orphans looking for a father, and he saw that sometimes the home you find is far more dangerous than the loneliness you leave behind. The family had its home. It had its members. But every family Leo Barnes knew needs a purpose, a destination. He turned his investigation away from the dusty commune and towards the glittering, treacherous hills of Hollywood. The answer wasn't just in the people Manson had collected. It was in the people he had desperately tried to become. Leo's research led him into a different kind of archive. Back issues of Rolling Stone, music industry trade papers, and tell-all biographies of rock and roll royalty. He was tracing a ghost, but this ghost had left a trail of burned bridges and terrified rock stars. The entry point was a name that seemed impossibly out of place in the grim narrative: Dennis Wilson. The handsome, sun-drenched drummer for the Beach Boys, the very embodiment of the clean-cut California dream. In the spring of 1968, Wilson picked up 2 female family members hitchhiking. Following rule number 1 to its logical conclusion, he invited them back to his sprawling mansion on Sunset Boulevard. Within days, the entire Manson family had moved in. Leo imagined the scene, a collision of 2 Americas. The family, with their feral energy and hollow-eyed devotion, camping out amidst the gold records and plush shag carpets. For a time, it was a symbiotic relationship. Wilson was intrigued by the free love ethos in Manson's charismatic guru-like persona. He had access to an endless supply of women and a captivated audience for his own spiritual musings. In return, Manson had his foot in the door of the world he worshipped. He had access to money, to food, to recording studios, and most importantly, to legitimacy. He wasn't a drifter anymore. He was a friend of a beach boy. But the documents revealed Wilson's growing terror. The freeloading turned into a financial drain, costing him a fortune. The free love had a dark, coercive undercurrent. And Manson's love was possessive, intense, and menacing. Leo found a quote from one of Wilson's friends in an old magazine. Dennis said Charlie was the wizard. He was mesmerized. A month later, he was whispering to me, "You have to be careful with this guy. He's got no fear." The relationship imploded, but not before Manson got what he wanted: an introduction. Dennis Wilson had passed him up the food chain to a man who could truly make him a star: Terry Melcher. This was the name that made the tumblers of the investigation click into place for Leo. Terry Melcher wasn't just a successful record producer. He was Hollywood royalty, the son of Doris Day. He represented the inner sanctum, the final gatekeeper, and for a brief, hopeful period, he showed interest in the scraggly musician from the desert. He visited Spawn Ranch, a surreal image Leo could vividly picture. The clean-cut producer in his expensive car, driving up a dusty, rutted road to a ramshackle movie set, surrounded by the blank-eyed stares of Manson's followers, to audition a man who believed he was the next Messiah. The audition was a failure. Melcher saw what Dennis Wilson had ultimately seen: a man with some raw, strange talent, but one who was too erratic, too undisciplined, and too dangerous. He gave Manson a polite brush-off and never came back. To the celebrity machine, it was just another Tuesday. Another wannabe rejected, but to Charles Manson, it was a profound, apocalyptic betrayal. The machine had dangled his ultimate fantasy in front of him: fame, adoration, a record deal, and then snatched it away. In Manson's narcissistic mind, the rejection was not a critique of his talent. It was a declaration of war. Leo leaned back, the pieces connecting with the force of a shotgun blast. He pulled out a property record he had requested from the city archives: 150 Cielo Drive, the address of the Tate murder house, the listed resident until early 1969, Terry Melcher. It wasn't a random act of terror. It was a message sent to a specific address intended for a specific man. Manson hadn't sent his followers to kill strangers. He had sent them to the house of the man who had broken his dreams, to slaughter the new occupants as a symbolic act of ultimate revenge. Sharon Tate and her friends were not the targets. They were the medium for the message. The message was for Hollywood. It was for the machine that had rejected him. He grabbed his notebook, his hand moving with a new, furious energy. He knew the third rule. It wasn't about ideology or a race war. Those were just the justifications, the tools Manson used to manipulate his followers. The core motive was far more petty, far more human, and far more LA. It was the toxic alchemy of hope and resentment that this city was built on. He wrote, Rule number 3. The celebrity machine Hollywood sells a beautiful dream that anyone, no matter how broken or obscure, can become a star. This dream is a powerful magnet, drawing in the hopeful and the desperate. But for every one person it elevates, it mercilessly chews up and spits out 1,000 others. Charles Manson was one of the chewed up. He played the game, got closer than most, and was ultimately rejected. The violence that followed was not the beginning of a new world order. It was the rage of a failed actor, the bloody tantrum of a rejected rock star. The Tate LaBianca murders were his twisted, horrifying closing argument to the industry that had refused to listen to his song. Leo looked out his window at the distant, glittering lights of the Hollywood hills. He finally understood the motive. It wasn't the work of a devil. It was the work of a jilted lover whose object of affection was fame itself. The obsession had taken on a life of its own. Leo Barnes's office was no longer just a room with a desk. It had become the physical manifestation of his theory. One entire wall was now a chaotic yet meticulously organized tapestry of death. Photos of the victims, the killers, and the peripheral players were connected by a web of red yarn. Headlines were tacked next to property deeds. Song lyrics were taped next to coroner's reports. It was the architecture of a nightmare, and Leo was its sole, sleepless architect. He had synthesized the first 3 rules into a cohesive narrative, a grim social mathematics that explained the inexplicable. He saw it all with a blinding clarity that felt like a religious revelation. The open-door policy of a generation had created the opportunity. The emotional vacuum of the nuclear family had provided the followers. The cruel machinery of Hollywood had supplied the motive. It was a perfect, horrifying storm. He felt a surge of exhilaration he hadn't felt in years, the thrill of a reporter who knows he's found the real story, the one hiding beneath all the others. He picked up the phone, his fingers smudged with ink, and dialed his editor in New York. "Elliot, it's Leo," he said, his voice crackling with an energy that had long been absent. "I've got it. I've got the whole damn thing." "Leo, thank God." Elliot's voice came through the line, sharp and pragmatic as a guillotine. "The deadline is breathing down my neck. Send me the draft. I need to see Manson. The girls, the blood, helter-skelter. Give me the monster." "That's just it, Elliot," Leo pressed, pacing the confines of his office, gesturing at his wall as if the editor could see it. "Manson isn't the story. He's the symptom. The story is the disease. It's about a cultural vacuum, about the way celebrity worship creates these pockets of resentment." A weary sigh traveled 3,000 miles across the phone line. "Leo, what are you talking about? I hired a crime reporter, not a sociologist. I need a true crime feature, not a doctoral thesis on the death of the 60s. Keep it simple. Evil exists. Charles Manson is evil. The end." Leo stopped pacing. A cold knot formed in his stomach. "You're not listening," he said, his voice losing its fire. "This is the real story. This is why it happened. It's not about good versus evil. It's about a society that was so lost it couldn't tell the difference. And it's a story that will put my readers to sleep." Elliot snapped, his patience gone. "Look, I respect your process, I really do. But I have 6 pages to fill and they need to be compelling. I need quotes from the trial. I need details about the murders. I need the horror. This academic stuff about found families and celebrity machines. It's background color, Leo. It's a paragraph, not the whole damn article." The editor's words landed like physical blows. He wasn't just critiquing the angle. He was invalidating the entire quest. He didn't want the truth. He wanted the myth because the myth was easier to sell. "I'm telling you, Elliot, this is a career-defining piece," Leo pleaded, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. It reframes the entire narrative. Then reframe it back, Elliot said, his tone final. I need a draft on my desk by Monday. Focus on Manson. Focus on the cult. Give the people the monster they expect. If you can't do that, I'll have to kill the feature and give the space to someone else. The line went dead. Leo stood in the silence of his office, the receiver still pressed to his ear. The exhilaration was gone, replaced by the familiar bitter taste of cynicism. He looked at his beautiful, terrible wall, his grand theory that explained everything. To him, it was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. To the world represented by Elliot, it was just academic stuff. He had spent weeks connecting the dots only to be told that no one was interested in the picture he had drawn. They just wanted to look at the darkest dot and call it a day. The system wasn't interested in a complex diagnosis. It wanted a simple monster, a scapegoat it could lock in a cage so everyone else could sleep at night, pretending the disease wasn't still out there, festering in the dark. He slumped into his chair and stared at the wall. The red yarn, which minutes ago had looked like the elegant lines of a brilliant theorem, now just looked like a madman's scrawl. The first real pushback hadn't come from a shadowy figure or a slammed door. It had come from the one person who was supposed to want the story, and it came in the form of a simple, soul-crushing demand. Give us the monster we already know. Defeat settled over Leo Barnes's office like a layer of dust. For 2 days after the call with Elliot, he did nothing. The wall, once a source of brilliant revelation, now felt like a monument to his own arrogance. It was a map of a country no one wanted to visit. Elliot's words echoed in the stale air. Give the people the monster they expect. He considered compromising. He could write the article Elliot wanted. He could recenter the narrative on Manson, the wild-eyed boogeyman, and sprinkle in his theories as academic seasoning. It would be easy. It would pay the bills. It would be a lie. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth, worse than his day-old coffee. He had spent his entire career chasing the truth, even when it was ugly or inconvenient. To betray that now felt like a small death. He slumped in his chair, staring at the web of yarn, and for the first time he felt his age. Maybe Elliot was right. Maybe he was just a relic, a dinosaur trying to explain the meteor to a world that just wanted to watch the explosion. The story was dead. On the third morning, as he was contemplating the soul-crushing task of dismantling his wall of evidence, the phone rang. He expected it to be Elliot, calling to officially kill the piece. He let it ring 3 times before picking it up with a heavy sigh. Barnes. The voice on the other end was quiet, cautious and unfamiliar. An older man. Am I speaking with Leo Barnes, the journalist? You are, Leo answered, his tone flat. My name is not important right now, the man said. I've been following your work for years. I read your pieces on the Z-Team robberies, the Chinatown exposé. You're a thorough man. You don't just report the crime. You report the architecture of the crime. Leo sat up a little straighter. Who is this? I was a junior lawyer on the prosecution team for the Tate LaBianca trial, the voice said, and the air in the room suddenly went still. I've read the recent articles about the upcoming anniversary. They're all the same. They all get it wrong, but I have a feeling you might be getting it right. A spark of life returned to Leo. What did they get wrong? Helter-skelter, the man said simply. Everyone focuses on helter-skelter. The race war, the Beatles' lyrics. It was a prosecutor's dream. It was a motive a jury could understand. It was simple, it was terrifying, and it was mostly bullshit. Leo's grip tightened on the receiver. What do you mean? It was a story, the lawyer said. A useful one. But it wasn't the engine. It wasn't how he did it. The real mechanism was much quieter and in many ways far more terrifying. We saw it in the preliminary interviews, the stuff that never made it to trial. We saw the machine, but we couldn't explain it to a jury, so we went with the story that would stick. A pause. If you really want to understand how it happened, you need to stop talking to cops and start talking to the people who were actually inside the machine. Most of them are dead or in prison for life, Leo countered. Not all of them, the voice said. You're missing the key. You need to find the man who built the machine with Charlie, and then walked away before it started killing. The one who knew the blueprints. Leo felt a surge of adrenaline. Who? His name is Paul Watkins, the lawyer said. He was Charlie's right-hand man, his main recruiter. He was the one who went out and found the lost sheep. But he was smart enough to see where it was going. He left the family a few months before the murders. He testified for the prosecution. His testimony was the stuff of nightmares, but we only used a fraction of it. He's the one who can tell you how Charlie turned those kids into robots. He's the real story. Where do I find him? Leo asked, already grabbing a pen. That's the hard part. He dropped off the map years ago. Last I heard, he was living out in the desert near Death Valley, trying to escape the ghosts. Another pause. This conversation never happened, Mr. Barnes. I'm an old man. I just want the right story to be told for once. The line clicked dead. Leo sat in the echoing silence, staring at the name he had scrawled on his notepad. Paul Watkins. It was a single, fragile thread. A ghost from the desert. His editor had closed the official door, but this old lawyer had just opened a secret passage. This was no longer an assignment from a New York magazine. It was a personal quest. The story wasn't dead. It had just gone underground. He stood up and looked at his wall. The red yarn no longer looked like a madman's scrawl. It looked like a road map, and it was pointing him east into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Mojave Desert. The Mojave Desert has no room for lies. Under the scorching sun and the brutally vast sky, everything is stripped down to the bone. As Leo Barnes drove his old Ford east, leaving the glittering mirage of Los Angeles behind, he felt like he was entering a world of elemental truth. This was where Charles Manson had taken his family to prepare for the end of the world. And this was where Leo hoped he would find the man who had escaped it. Finding Paul Watkins was like looking for a specific grain of sand. He spent 2 days in dusty, forgotten towns on the edge of Death Valley, places where time seemed to have stopped. He talked to bartenders, to general store owners, to men with sun-cured skin and eyes that trusted no one. Finally, an old gas station attendant gave him the lead. "There's a fella lives out that way," he said, pointing toward a jagged range of rocks in the distance. "Keeps to himself. Likes it that way." Watkins's home was little more than a shack, cobbled together from scrap wood and corrugated tin, dwarfed by a landscape of rock and creosote bush. A man emerged as Leo's car kicked up a plume of dust. He was about Leo's age, but the desert had carved deeper lines into his face. His long hair was gray, and his clear blue eyes held a permanent state of weariness and vigilance. This was not an old hippie. This was a survivor. "Can I help you?" Watkins asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound that held no welcome. "Mr. Watkins?" Leo asked, getting out of the car, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "My name is Leo Barnes. I'm a journalist." Watkins' eyes narrowed. "I don't talk to journalists." He turned to go back inside. "I'm not here to ask about the murders," Leo said quickly, his voice sharp in the dry air. "I don't care about Helter Skelter. I'm here to ask you a question I think only you can answer." Leo paused. How did he do it? Not why. How? Watkins stopped, his back still to Leo. The question, so different from the sensational ones he'd faced for years, seemed to land. He turned back slowly, appraising Leo with a new intensity. "Come inside," he said. "It's too hot out here." The inside of the shack was astonishingly sparse. No television, no phone. Just books, an old guitar, and a window that looked out onto the endless desert. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table. "He was a mirror," Watkins began, his voice sounding very far away. "That was the first secret. Charlie had no personality of his own. He became whatever you needed him to be. To the girls, he was the father, the lover. To the guys, he was the big brother, the guru. He reflected your deepest needs back at you, and you loved him for it. But charisma isn't enough to make people kill," Leo said. "No." Watkins agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. That was just the bait. The real machine started working once you were inside. He closed his eyes as if replaying a horrific film. It was a process. A deliberate dismantling. First the LSD, we didn't take it for fun. Charlie used it as a tool. Ego death, he called it. He'd get you high, way out in the desert at night, and then he'd start his raps. He'd talk for hours. Disjointed stories about death, rebirth, love, fear. Your mind is wide open, you're vulnerable, and he pours his chaos into it. Brainwashing, Leo said. More than that, Watkins replied. It was an erasure of the old reality and the installation of a new one. He isolated us. No newspapers, no mail, no contact with the outside world. Spawn Ranch became our entire universe, and Charlie was the sun. His word was law. Then came the repetition. He'd say the same things hundreds of times until they weren't ideas anymore, they were unquestionable truths. Death is change. There is no right and wrong. Give up your mind. Leo felt a chill run down his spine, despite the heat. He was listening to the blueprint for a mental prison. And finally, the fear. Watkins continued, his voice now a whisper. The chaos wasn't random. It was by design. Charlie created constant stress, constant paranoia, the creepy crawly missions into strangers' homes just to move their furniture. His sudden violent rages, you never knew what was coming next. Life became a state of permanent alert, and the only escape from that fear was to trust Charlie completely. He broke you, and then he made himself the only savior. And helter-skelter? Leo asked. Watkins opened his eyes. They were empty. Helter-skelter was his masterpiece. It wasn't a belief. It was a tool. It was the final story that gave all that chaos a meaning. It turned us from a bunch of drifters into soldiers in a cosmic war. It turned murder into survival. It was the perfect lie. Leo sat in silence, stunned by the methodical cruelty of it all. This wasn't a cult. It was a human reprogramming project. Manson wasn't just a charismatic leader. He was an engineer of the soul, a master of psychological warfare. He pulled out his notebook, his hand shaking slightly. He had the final, most terrifying piece of the puzzle. It explained how the lost children had been turned into killing machines. He wrote, Rule number 4. Controlled Chaos Manson had created a system built on disorientation. Through ego death, isolation, repetition, and fear, he systematically destroyed the free will of his followers. He created a storm in their minds and then positioned himself as the eye of the hurricane, the only place of safety. The family wasn't a shelter from the world. It was a shelter from the madness he himself had created. Leo thanked the man for sharing his ghosts. As he drove away, leaving the small shack to be swallowed by the vast desert, he knew he had the whole story. A story far more terrifying than the simple devil his editor wanted. This was the story of how one human being can take apart another, piece by piece, until nothing is left but hollow obedience. The drive back from the desert was a blur. The vast empty landscape that had seemed so intimidating on the way out now felt like a place of stark clarity. Leo Barnes didn't return to his office. The thought of that room with its ringing phones and looming deadlines felt profane. Instead, he checked into a cheap, anonymous motel on the frayed edge of Los Angeles, a place where the city's glitter finally gave way to dust and desperation. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. It was the perfect laboratory for a social autopsy. He didn't sleep. For the next 24 hours, under the flickering fluorescent light and the drone of a struggling air conditioner, he worked with a feverish intensity. He taped several large sheets of butcher paper to the peeling paint of the motel room wall, creating a makeshift canvas. Then he emptied his briefcase. Photos, photocopied documents, witness statements, and pages torn from his own notebook spilled across the stained carpet. This was his moment of synthesis. He stood before the blank wall, a felt-tip pen in his hand, and began to draw the architecture of a nightmare. He wasn't just a journalist anymore. He was a cartographer, mapping the fault lines of a fallen generation. He began by writing the 4 rules in bold letters, spaced far apart, like the 4 corners of a dark new world. The door is never closed. 2. The found family. 3. The celebrity machine. 4. Controlled chaos. He stared at them, the pillars of his theory. Individually, they were insightful. But the real horror he now understood was in how they connected, how they fed into one another to create an inescapable, self-perpetuating system of destruction. He drew his first line, a thick arrow connecting rule number 1 to rule number 2. This is the front door, he muttered to himself, the words raspy in the quiet room. The naive trust, the cultural imperative to be open, to accept everyone. It didn't invite Manson in. It created a vacuum that sucked him in. It was the perfect environment for a predator posing as a prophet. He tacked up a photo of the smiling hippies in Golden Gate Park. But an open door doesn't keep people inside. He drew the second arrow. Rule number 2, the found family, is what bolted the door from the inside. He pinned the photos of Susan, Patricia, and Leslie next to it, the lost children. He didn't offer them an ideology. He offered them a father, a home. He filled the emotional void that their own families and a fractured society had created. He fed their hunger for belonging. This is the anchor. This is what made them stay. The picture was forming, but it was still incomplete. It explained the commune, but not the murders. So you have a locked room full of devoted children, Leo continued, his pen moving to the third rule. What do you do with them? You give them an enemy. He drew a long, aggressive arrow from rule number 2 to rule number 3, the celebrity machine. This is the engine. The motive. Manson's bitter, rejected ambition. He pointed all that love, all that devotion at a single target, the Hollywood system that had scorned him. He transformed their personal need for a family into a collective lust for revenge. He taped up a photo of the Cielo Drive house, then another of Terry Melcher. The murders weren't about a race war. They were a twisted love letter to the industry that broke his heart. It gave the family a purpose. He stood back, looking at the 3 interconnected points. It was a powerful theory, but there was still a piece missing, a crucial, terrifying leap. How do you get loving, devoted children to actually pick up the knives? He took a deep breath and drew the final dark arrow from rule number 3 to rule number 4, controlled chaos. This is the trigger, he whispered. This is the mechanism that turns a human being into a weapon. He pinned up a single, stark word he'd transcribed from his conversation with Paul Watkins: ego death. This is Manson's genius, Leo said, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and awe. He used every tool at his disposal, LSD, isolation, repetition, fear, to systematically dismantle their identities. He didn't brainwash them. He erased them. He created a constant state of psychological terror and then positioned himself as the only source of safety. He broke their minds and then rebuilt them in his own image. He finally stepped back from the wall. It was complete. A horrifying flowchart that began with a flower and ended with a bloody knife. It was a perfect self-contained system. The culture opened the door. The need for family kept them inside. The thirst for fame gave them a target, and the systematic destruction of their free will pulled the trigger. He saw it all. The grand design. It wasn't a story about one evil man. It was the story of a perfect storm, where a societal disease met a generational vulnerability, and the result was a monster who was simply the right predator at the right time. He sat down on the edge of the cheap motel bed, the energy that had fueled him for days suddenly draining away, leaving him exhausted and empty. He had the truth. A truth far more complex and damning than the simple helter-skelter narrative the world had accepted. This truth didn't just indict Charles Manson. It indicted the entire era. It indicted the naive dreams of the hippies, the cold neglect of their parents, the cruel fantasy of Hollywood. He looked at the wall, at his terrible map. Elliot didn't want this story. This story didn't have a simple monster. The monster in this story was us. But the old lawyer's words came back to him. I just want the right story to be told for once. A new resolve hardened in his gut. This was more than a magazine feature. It was a historical correction. It was his responsibility. He reached for his old portable typewriter, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and rolled it into the machine. He typed a title, The Sharp Clack of the Keys, a Declaration of Intent in the Silent Room. The Cursed Rules. The motel room, which had been Leo's laboratory, became his monastery. For 3 days and 3 nights, the only sounds were the rhythmic, percussive clatter of his portable typewriter and the occasional scrape of his chair. He was no longer just reporting a story. He was building a case, laying down each sentence with the precision of a prosecutor. He poured everything into those pages. The ghosts from the library, the raw pain from the court transcripts, the chilling, methodical madness he'd heard in Paul Watkins's voice. He wrote not about a monster, but about a machine. He structured the entire article around his 4 rules, giving each its own chapter, its own damning evidence. It was a piece of long-form journalism, unlike any he had ever written. It was sharp, analytical, and relentless. It was an indictment. When he was finished, he read it over once, not to edit, but to confirm that it was all there, that the truth he'd uncovered had survived the journey from his mind to the page. It had. He packed the thick manuscript into a heavy mailer, addressed it to the magazine's office in New York City, and sent it on its way. It felt less like a submission and more like launching a message in a bottle into a vast, indifferent ocean. Then, he waited. The silence that followed was a unique form of torture. He returned to his office at the Chronicle, the motel room's makeshift evidence wall now just a memory. He tried to work on other assignments, but his mind was 3,000 miles away, in an editor's office in Manhattan. A week later, the call came. My office. Now was all Elliot said before hanging up. His voice was glacial. Leo walked into the editor's office and closed the door behind him. Elliot was standing by the window, his back to Leo, holding the manuscript. He didn't turn around for a full minute. "What the hell is this, Leo?" he finally asked, his voice low and tight with controlled fury. He turned, and his face was a mask of disbelief and anger. "I asked you for a true crime feature, a definitive look back at one of America's most notorious killers. I asked for the monster." He tossed the manuscript onto his desk. It landed with a heavy final thud. "Instead, you gave me a goddamn sociology lecture. The found family? The celebrity machine? What is this? This isn't a story about murder. This is a term paper." "It's the only story that matters," Leo said, his voice calm. He had prepared for this. "Anyone can write about the blood, Elliot. We've been doing it for 25 years. It's easy. It's lazy. It doesn't explain a thing. It just gawks at the horror. The horror is what people want to read." Elliot shot back, his voice rising. "They want to be scared. They want to know that a man like Manson is a freak of nature, a one-off. They don't want to be told that he's a product of his time, that the same cultural forces that gave them Woodstock also gave them Cielo Drive. It's confusing. It's uncomfortable." "The truth is uncomfortable," Leo said, taking a step closer to the desk. "You asked me to paint a picture of the monster. I'm giving you the blueprint for the factory that built him. Rule number 1 created a generation of unlocked doors. Rule number 2 filled the empty houses with lost, lonely children. Rule number 3 pointed them like a loaded gun at the heart of Hollywood. And rule number 4 pulled the trigger by erasing their free will. It's not a theory, Elliot. It's a mechanism. It's the how." He picked up the manuscript, his own conviction giving him strength. "After a quarter of a century, don't you think people are ready for more than just the boogeyman? Don't you think they're ready to understand that this wasn't an anomaly? This was a warning. A warning about what happens when a society loses its way, when families crumble, and when the dream of fame becomes more important than human decency. This isn't a history lesson. It's a mirror." Elliot stared at him, caught between his commercial instincts and the undeniable power of Leo's argument. He was a businessman, but he was also an editor, and he recognized the rare, dangerous scent of a story that could define an era. He snatched the manuscript back from Leo's hand, his anger giving way to a grudging, conflicted respect. "This is a risk, Leo," he said, his voice now a low growl. "A huge risk. You're asking my readers to think. You're asking them to look at their own culture, their own history, and see the complicity. It's easier to just hate Manson." "Let them," Leo said. "Hate Manson. But understand him. Understand the world that made him possible. Because that world hasn't gone away. The rules just change." The two men stood in silence, the manuscript on the desk between them like a peace treaty and a declaration of war. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, the pragmatist at war with the journalist inside him. He hated the article's lack of sensationalism. He loved its terrifying intelligence. Finally, he collapsed into his chair, picking up the manuscript one more time. He didn't look at Leo. "I have to read it again," he said, his voice flat, defeated and intrigued all at once. "Get out of my office." He opened the first page, his eyes already scanning the text, shutting Leo out completely. "Don't call me." "I'll call you." Leo walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He hadn't won, but he hadn't lost either. He had fired his shot, and now all he could do was wait and see if the truth was powerful enough to survive contact with the real world. It hit the newsstands on a Thursday. The magazine cover was a stark, minimalist design. A single, grainy black and white photograph of the Spawn Ranch girls, smiling their hollow smiles. Above them, in bold, blood-red letters, was the title Leo had typed in that lonely motel room, "The Cursed Rules." Elliot had taken the risk. He had published the article in its entirety, a sprawling 14-page centerpiece. It was a journalistic mic drop, and the silence that followed lasted for about 6 hours. Then the phones began to ring, and they didn't stop. The backlash was a tidal wave, and it came from two opposing shores, crashing into Leo from both sides. To the establishment, the conservatives, the silent majority, he was an apologist for evil. He received letters, some handwritten in elegant, furious cursive, others typed in angry block capitals, accusing him of sympathizing with monsters, of trying to excuse the inexcusable. A local TV pundit called his article a dangerous work of moral relativism that spits on the graves of the victims. But the more surprising, and in many ways more painful, criticism came from the other side. From the children of the 60s themselves. To them, Leo was a traitor. He had taken their dream, the summer of love, the promise of a new consciousness, and smeared it with the filth of the Manson family. He received calls on late-night radio shows from men and women whose voices cracked with emotion, accusing him of blaming their beautiful revolution for creating a monster. Manson wasn't one of us, a caller insisted. He was an aberration. You're defiling our history. Leo had become a man without a country. He was too radical for the establishment and too critical for the counterculture. He had told a truth so complex that it had alienated everyone. The fallout at the Chronicle was quieter, but no less brutal. No one told him he was fired. They didn't have to. The newsroom became a minefield of averted glances and conversations that abruptly stopped when he approached. Colleagues who had once sought his advice now gave him a wide berth in the hallway. He was controversial. He was toxic. He had broken the unspoken rule of journalism. Don't become the story. His lowest point came a week after the article was published. He was in his office late at night. The city lights of Los Angeles a cold, indifferent constellation outside his window. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on his desk next to two piles of clippings. One pile was the scathing reviews and angry letters to the editor. The other, much smaller pile, contained a few thoughtful critiques from academics and sociologists who praised the article's depth. It brought him no comfort. He hadn't illuminated the past. He had just given everyone new shadows to fight in. The world didn't feel wiser. It just felt angrier. He looked at the wall where his Manson map had once been. Now just a blank space filled with old tack holes. Maybe Elliot had been right. Maybe the world just wanted its simple monsters. Maybe the truth he had worked so hard to uncover was a truth no one actually needed. A key to a door no one wanted to open. He poured another whiskey, the bitter liquid doing nothing to numb the profound sense of failure. He had told the truth, and his reward was to be utterly, completely alone. It was then that he noticed the letter. It had been mixed in with the inter-office mail, a simple hand-addressed envelope with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in Oregon. The handwriting was neat, careful, and belonged to a woman. Assuming it was another piece of hate mail, he almost tossed it in the trash, but something made him pause. He tore it open. The letter was short, written on simple, lined paper. Dear Mr. Barnes, I am writing to you about your article, The Cursed Rules. My name will not mean anything to you, but Patricia Krenwinkel is my older sister. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He sat down, his heart pounding. For 25 years, my family has lived with the ghost of a monster. The girl we loved, the quiet, insecure big sister I looked up to, vanished. In her place was this creature the world called Katie. We have never understood how it could have happened. We have never been able to reconcile the two people. Your article is the first thing I have ever read that does not ask me to. You did not excuse what she did. The word evil is not strong enough for the pain she caused. But you looked past the monster and you saw the lost child. You showed the world the hunger that she had, the vacuum that he filled. You described the machine that took my sister from me. It does not bring her back. It does not bring any of them back. But for the first time in a long time, I feel a sense of understanding instead of just horror. For that, a stranger you will never meet is grateful. Thank you for not just showing us the monster. Thank you for showing us the path that led to her door. The letter was unsigned. Leo read it again, and then a third time. The whiskey on his desk remained untouched. The angry clippings and the academic praise suddenly seemed irrelevant. This single quiet voice from the wilderness was the only validation that mattered. He hadn't written the story for the pundits or the historians or the readers of a glossy magazine. He had written it for this unknown woman. He had written it for all the families, the victims and the killers, who were left behind to make sense of the wreckage. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. The price of the truth had been high. His reputation was in tatters and he was more isolated than ever. But in that moment, sitting alone in his dark office, Leo Barnes knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it had been worth it. The letter did not magically fix Leo Barnes's fractured career. It did not quiet the angry voices on the radio or mend his reputation in the newsroom, but it did something more important. It recalibrated his compass. He was no longer adrift in a sea of public opinion. He had his true north. The article was not a failure. It was an act of translation, decoding the language of horror for those who needed to understand it most. His final gambit, then, was not a dramatic, external act. There was no secret meeting, no last-minute leak. The war was already over. This last move was a quiet, personal pilgrimage. He needed to close the circle, to stand in the place where the story had truly begun and ended. The following weekend, he filled a thermos with coffee, got in his old Ford, and drove north into the sere, brown hills of the Santa Susana Mountains. He followed a winding, poorly maintained road until it turned to dirt. The air grew hotter, dustier. Finally, he saw the sign, riddled with bullet holes and bleached by the sun, Spawn Movie Ranch. He parked the car and got out. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. The ranch was gone. A wildfire had swept through years ago, wiping the slate clean. All that remained were a few blackened foundations, some rusted metal scraps, and the ghosts. Leo walked the grounds, his feet crunching on the dry, scorched earth. This was the stage. This was where Rule Number 1 had welcomed the lost, where Rule Number 2 had forged a new family in the crucible of need, and where Rule Number 4 had dismantled their minds. He stood on the spot where the main ranch house had been, the place where Manson had held court, preaching his sermons of chaos and love. He could almost hear the faint, ghostly echo of a poorly tuned guitar. This wasn't a place of demonic power, he realized. It was just a sad, forgotten patch of dirt. The evil hadn't been in the land. It had been in the people, and not just in one man, but in the collective emptiness they had all brought here, an emptiness that Manson had so skillfully filled with his own poison. He walked to a small, shaded grove of trees that had somehow survived the fire. He knew from his research that this was where the family often gathered, where the girls would sing their devotional songs to Charlie. He sat on a large, smooth rock, the same rock that had likely served as a stage for Manson's prophecies. He pulled the letter from his pocket, the one from Patricia Krenwinkel's sister, and read it again. You looked past the monster and you saw the lost child. That had been the key all along. The world wanted to see the family as an invading army of demons. It was simpler that way. But they weren't. They were a refugee crisis. They were the casualties of a different kind of war, a cultural war that had left them spiritually homeless. Manson hadn't created them. He had simply found them, huddled together, and offered them a flag to wave. Leo understood his final gambit. It wasn't to expose a secret or win an argument. It was an act of witness. His article was his testimony. He was standing on this scorched earth not for the living who would read his words, but for the dead, for Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and all the others who had died because of a failed rock star's bruised ego. And he was also standing here for the other dead, for the lost children whose souls had been murdered long before their bodies were sent to prison. The children on the smiling photograph who had been erased by Sadie Mae and Katie. A hawk circled high overhead, its shadow gliding over the desolate landscape. Leo folded the letter and put it away. He didn't need it anymore. The truth of it was now a part of him. His journey had not been about finding a monster, but about understanding a tragedy in its entirety. And the tragedy was not just the murders. The tragedy was that a generation had sought a new kind of family, and this is what they had found. He stood up, his joints aching slightly. He felt a sense of quiet closure. He had faced the ghosts of his past, the story that had haunted him for a quarter of a century, and he had finally told its true story. He hadn't brought redemption or healing, some wounds are too deep for that, but he had brought understanding, and sometimes that is the only form of peace that is possible. As he drove away, the desolate ranch shrinking in his rearview mirror, he didn't feel like a victorious journalist. He felt like a cartographer who had finally finished a difficult map, a map that showed with terrible clarity the exact point where a dream of love had veered off course and driven straight into the heart of a nightmare. He had done his job. The map was now in the world's hands. It was up to them to read it. The lecture hall at a small, respected university was bathed in the warm, late afternoon light. Leo Barnes stood at the lectern. He was older now, his hair completely gray, the lines on his face deeper, telling the story of a man who had stared into the abyss and hadn't blinked. He had retired from the daily grind of the newsroom, but he had not retired from the truth. And so, he was saying, his voice a low, gravelly sound that commanded the attention of the journalism students before him. We spend our time, as reporters and as a society, dissecting the predators. We analyze their methods, their motives, their madness. It's a necessary science, but it is an incomplete one. He leaned against the lectern, his gaze sweeping across the young, eager faces. We tell ourselves that evil is an anomaly, a rogue element that invades our otherwise safe and rational world, a monster. But the most successful predators in history do not thrive in the shadows. They thrive in our blind spots. They flourish in the permissive environments we create through our own silence, our own biases, and our own desperate need to believe in something, anything. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. A man like Charles Manson doesn't just appear out of thin air. He is forged in the specific furnace of his era, the cursed rules that allowed him to flourish, the radical openness, the collapse of the family unit, the toxic worship of celebrity, the deliberate weaponization of chaos, were unique to that time. But the danger is eternal. His eyes found a student in the third row, a bright, intense-looking young woman who was hanging on his every word. Charismatic leaders who exploit division and desire are not a relic of the past. The hunger for a family, for a tribe to belong to in a world that feels increasingly lonely, is more powerful than ever. The seductive, destructive promise of fame is the background radiation of our modern lives. He pushed himself off the lectern, his voice dropping to a more intimate, urgent tone. So the question I leave you with is not what a monster did more than 50 years ago. The question is, what are the cursed rules of our time? What are the blind spots we are all collectively ignoring right now? What is the cultural hunger that is going unfed, creating a vacuum? And who right now is smiling and walking through our own unlocked doors, promising to feed it? The bell rang, its sharp sound breaking the spell. Students began to shuffle their papers, the familiar ritual of the end of class, but the camera lingered on Leo's face, weary but resolute. It then panned across the students and settled on the young woman in the third row. She wasn't packing her bag. She was scribbling furiously in her notebook, trying to capture the essence of his final warning. She paused her writing and looked up, her eyes meeting Leo's across the room. For a brief, charged moment, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. It was a look of understanding, a teacher who had passed on his most important lesson and a student who had truly received it. It was the passing of a torch. The echo of Leo Barnes's long, painful journey had found a new voice. The search for the real story would continue. Fade to black.